So this is a draft of something I've been working on in a different context that in the midst of the pandemic, I started realizing that it was certainly applicable to a different way of thinking about some of the tools we were forced into. So the title of the paper is Revaluing Giving Way. I'm going to read through it as kind of expressively as I possibly can, I hope. So the hiatus that occurred in many people's lives due to the global pandemic exposed a paucity in our shared language. Whether dubbed a stay-at-home order, quarantine, lockdown, these terms place the creative struggle to restrain action in individual and negatively moral terms. So we hear this in somebody like Jeffrey Schnapp's description of the scene: an entire society forced into a holding pattern, reduced to atomized individuals, family units that find themselves parked instead of on the move. Abundant signs of dispossession, disability, and alienation, all the telltale signs of collective isolation. So the act of setting aside non-essential obligations to the degree possible, retreating to one's residence to disrupt the vectors of transmission, lacked aggression. Staying home, while clearly life-affirming, felt abnormally passive. So the disdain towards such lesser acts pervades, of course, American culture, where there's a deep-seated discontent towards refusal, restraint, and things like that. This is true to some degree within design education as well. One clear instance where this appears is the urgent elevation of a kind of monolithic and polarized framing of agency. A consequence of this I want to show is that unaction, and I say unaction, not inaction, is cast as passive, anti-gentle, or worse, right? It crowds out subtleties that are worthwhile, I think, in education. So this presentation then explores these through what Stephen Connor calls giving way, or comportments of forbearance, because I want to understand them as positive acts that underpin design education during the pandemic and, of course, beyond. I want to be very clear. Teaching involves agency. I encourage my students to grow agency and to help others gain it. So I'm not advocating either side of some kind of false binary between social agency and, say, disciplinarity, or for criticality or social political inaction, or even some kind of spiritual humility. Right? While some of these have their time and place, often they're conservative, even puritanical pursuits that do not interest me. I want to recognize and revalue concessive bearings, I think, that are lost in the rush. While in education, these comportments are everywhere, I want to focus on the intertwining of the framing, language, and gestures of the video teleconferencing platform Zoom, which obviously I am myself still on. Through the banal examples, I claim such bearings show us the world differently and the exercise of power over power on which architectural actions, of course, depend. So to be an embodied human is to possess agency, or the capacity to think, feel, and act. This sense of humanness has historically been defined by its categorical difference to non-humans. In recent decades, this anthropocentric conception has been questioned. Technology, matter, things are increasingly seen as co-constitutive of human agency, or having their own quasi-agency as actors in the world. From things like chemicals, codes, tools, to technoscientific efforts to manage planetary systems, the calls for and claims to agency in architecture have expanded. With overlapping crises, agency has rightly been elevated to the foreground of architectural imaginary, right, as part of this kind of larger effort to leverage architecture's impact, as well as equalize and make just human flourishings for wider segments of society while making the world ecologically survivable. This elevation, of course, has breached disciplinary boundaries too. Someone like David Harvey argues that the figure of the architect is a metaphor for our own agency as we go about our daily practices and through them effectively preserve, construct, and reconstruct our life world. Such instances, I think, tell us a lot about the architect's worth as well as the education that shapes them. If it's not already clear, I'm not arguing that agency or its expansion is a problem. The problem, I believe, is when the framing becomes too monolithic and polarizing. So consider Jeremy Till's compelling theorization of agency and its negotiated role in Architecture Depends from 2009. In working to point the way past the heroic architect and the cultivated obsession with autonomy, purity, and control. He argues for dependency as a crucial and even defining feature of architectural practice. So this term holds various connotations, including contingency and reliance on things and people from beginning of and end to design process. Now, even in this subtle and thoughtful reading of architecture's entanglements, a monolithic and polarized sense kind of prevails. In this, quote, stance of modesty, he writes, there is a sense of resignation to contingency as one's fate, which may in turn restrict the means of dealing with that fate productively. Immediately in the next paragraph, he turns and says this, quoting the now disgraced Buddhist thinker Sogyal Rinpoche, he says, the constant uncertainty may make everything seem bleak and almost hopeless. If you look more deeply at it, you'll see that its very nature creates gaps, spaces in which profound chance and opportunities for transformation are continuously flowering, if, that is, they are seen and seized. Thus, whatever restraint abounds in dependency is quickly stamped with the demand for kind of domineering action. Till's quick dismissal is certainly odd, that is, until we see it through this kind of polarized lens. As Connor notes, the wide acceptance of the value of what is called agency makes everything that does not allow for or might require the restraining of agency, along with everything that might suggest the moderation of power rather than empowerment, puzzling or provoking. Why is this? So certainly it's complicated. My initial sense, and this is something I'm going to develop, is because I think it's tied up with ongoing investment in kind of modernity's dynamic stabilization, or what the sociologist Harmut Rosa calls the logic of escalation. That is, this mode of aggression, he says, which involves an imperative to increase what is available, accessible, and attainable. Growth mandated at a deep level is bent on the expansion of humanity's active share of the world. Thus, checks on this potential are taken as an affront to both the underlying escalation of growth and, in some cases, morality in general. And so I think if we shift our attention, at least provisionally, from understanding design education as the marshaling of the ways and means of assertive potential to comportments that emerge from cascading abstentions, right, what might this kind of look like? Now, of course, if you're of a more realist bent, you may say that every instance of design entails negotiation. In the profession, such acts are manifest through numerous ways of accommodating structural members, limits of construction budgets, changing demands of a client. In school, time constraints, limits of skills, personal budgets, to name a couple. Right? These are all sort of checks on assertion. So designers accommodate these forces in their practices, protocols, and of course, their realized work. But these instances are, I think, different than the ones I'm trying to draw out. The primary distinction is designers who face these pressures typically seek to hold power, to remain assertive for the sake of intentions, quality, or some other set of reasons. I'm interested in the multitude of fleeting ways forbearance does its subtle work. Right? One issue is that unlike agency, which acts as a strong and durable umbrella for morally positive and assertive actions, there's difficulty when it comes to putting language to these countervailing forces. One issue is the lack of a kind of unified term for these bearings, right, or for the performance of non-performances. And so it basically has to rely on this kind of huge lexicon, including terms like silence, reserve, shyness, reticence, restraint, so on and so forth. As this list suggests, it's hard to pin down a kind of generalizable theory without recourse to specific actions and their phenomenological bearing. Giving way, Connor explains, is about as close to a satisfactory phrase as one can find to catch the range of these bearings. These dispositions, he notes, are diverse and ubiquitous because it is neither the opposite of power nor its simple abdication, but rather its necessary modulation. If it helps, we can think of it like pumping the brakes or downshifting while driving a car. It's not inaction, but it's a positive act of an unassertive nature. When we start to look for these in teaching and learning, of course, we see them everywhere. demurring, stepping back, retreating, refusing, staying silent, simply saying, no, thank you. In much more humble ways than in, say, moments of protest where refusal comes to the foreground, these unactions are ambiguously part and part of architectural life and our everyday experiences of it, of course. And so to think about this modulation, I want to turn to Zoom. So in 2020, obviously the use for education became so ubiquitous that Zoom University was coined as a pejorative term for online education. Right? And while Zoom as a brand might actually be fleeting, this type of interface, of course, is old. The pandemic kind of exposed it as kind of necessary. And of course, I think it's going to be with us for some time, for the sake of expediency and for those in education without the privileges of health, mobility, funds, and other things. Thus, there's a need to kind of think more carefully about it. Against its very nature, my sense is, it's against its very name, my sense is that concessive bearings are required, produced, and ironically activated by its digital mediation. In the few minutes I have left, I'm going to draw out a couple examples. As you're aware, the platform joins discrete spaces and times into a synchronous digital frame that makes for effective and possibly meaningful space for teaching and learning. Within its gridded and assigned cells, bodily fragments, heads, shoulders, arms, hands, slightly hollowed out voices, hang together on a flattened screen. What it does best is provide a space for communication through multimodal streams. Its benefit, of course, are tempered by the split attention required to grasp expressive voices, faces, hands, right, and simultaneous presentation of visual information, emojis, multiple chat streams, and right, and sometimes like myself in meetings, checking email. Obviously, its grouping of boxes are not neutral, right? It simultaneously supports and distorts how relationships to others in the world are produced. The yellow highlighted speaker box undercuts the head of the table. A charismatic and athletic person of 6'8", 300 pounds is made physically equivalent to someone 4'8", 90 pounds, introverted and with mobility issues. In modulating difference, it activates our acquiescence to this leveling. When this happens, right, this should not be mistaken as either emancipatory or some kind of aggregate of fiction, right? Privilege, disparity, and other forms of difference show themselves on this platform. Right, internet speeds, backgrounds, not to mention those marked out as other simply due to the way they appear, think, or speak relative to dominant cultural norms. And so entering into a Zoom meeting offers really no guarantee of effortless and transparent communication, right? I currently have anxiety that this is going to shut down at some point because my internet will stop. So unlike Martin Heidegger's famous hammer, this tool rarely recedes into the background of our actions for long. For Heidegger, when the hammer breaks, we recognize its place in our everyday practical comportment of working. While not broken, Zoom is simply prone to not being fluid, right, to glitches. And so questions like, can you see my screen, which I opened with both intentionally and for humor now, or we lost you there for a minute, repeatedly call us to give way to the technological frame. While frustrating, and a real source of exhaustion, aspects like this put Zoom's mediation on display. Also, its lack of white noise, which pervades social space, makes conversations lethargic and conspicuous. When there are external noises, say an ambulance siren, instead of being assigned, or instead of simply something that happens in the background of our lives, in Zoom, it's associated with the speaker and their inability to control their acoustic environment. In examples like these, we sense the platform's place in our teaching and our learning. Thus, Zoom is potentially arguably less maybe a technology and closer to what Alva Noah calls a strange tool, which like art unveils us to ourselves. It helps produce a frame where we catch ourselves in the act of comporting ourselves towards others. While this can be disconcerting for some people, these comportments offers ways of relating, experiencing, and disclosing aspects of the world. They are, as the philosopher Charles Taylor explains, bound to a context of meaningful enactment. Being acquired and created within a a tacit background of shared understanding. Expressions of these bearings presuppose both an already intelligible world and some capacity for ingenuity. What's interesting to me about Zoom is not the ingenuity, but the amazing banality that just kind of shows up everywhere. So questions like, do we have everyone here? Or let's give them another minute, show us how bearings of patience which verge on reticence pervade its frame. Zoom also seems to summon inordinate amounts of apologizing. Sorry I was late. My apologies for interrupting. There's a lag, please go ahead. Oops, my favorite, I was on mute. The banality of this language, of course, is knotted up with our gestures. As Marian Novak and Susan Golden Meadow show, gestures are bodily movements in which abstracted action, representational action occur. Like holding up a finger as if to physicalize a thought, they arise from embodied simulation of the motor and perceptual states that occur during speaking and thinking. To put this differently, gestures do not transparently encode and communicate information as vehicles, they imitate. Because of this, they're actually concessive. Right? Consider a few of these. Holding out the hands, palms up to pass speaking to someone else. Unclasping the hands to mime division, covering one's face to physicalize total exasperation, which my students seem to find as funny. Or of course, the weird wave at the end of meetings or whatever's going on in this weirdness. She's now my TA, so clearly it worked out for her. So examples like these, and I'm sure you could think of lots more, perform non-performances, which open up a world to us differently. So what do I mean by this? I think they help us create a particular kind of sociality. In Connor's terms, right, these comportments are part of the way we deflect aggression into civility. To me, this seems a bit overstated, right? We're not coming into educational environments in such a confrontational way, usually. Rather, I'd say that they're a combination of lesser acts offer ways of attending to others with a modicum of care that reveal our patience, humility, and other values, right? Which makes, in many respects, learning possible, right? And in the pandemic, of course, this kind of sociality, of course, is the very least we could do for each other. So why does this matter, right? To end, what I think is important to recognize in the kind of modes of forbearance are required to produce and activated by Zoom are not simply things under which a logic of escalation should be seized as kind of resources in Till's terms. Rather, I think by seeing their roles in architectural lives beyond a kind of narrow framing, my hunch, and this is where I think this is going, is that Giving Way might offer clues to think about a post-growth model of education. In other words, is there a way to think about education that is not complicit in unchecked escalation or some kind of reactionary de-escalation, right, where people would obviously get hurt? And might one important lesson from the pandemic be modulation? Thank you.